David Glazer, who you got to hear speak in the last session, who was incredibly interesting, and so I can't really wait to hear what you're going to talk about here. And Anthony Philippakakis, how do you spell it?
Anthony Philippakis, but you can call me Anthony.
Right. And Anthony, thank you, from Broad Institute, and they're going to share their presentation with you. Would you guys prefer to have questions asked during the presentation or wait till the end?
During. No questions. During.
Yeah, so hi everyone, and as I said in the end of the last session, this is really a direct segue from what I talked about in the previous session. And what we want to do is, after we give you a little bit of intro, I think if we were to do nothing but talk, we have maybe 20 minutes of material, and that's by design. We wanted it to be very interactive and learn from you all. Because what we want to lay out is what we see is how can we take and generalize exactly what we just described with Autism Speaks. Where are the parts of that that make sense to apply to people in these communities, not this community, but in these communities, which is, I think, the right way to think about it. And we're going to walk through what we think that looks like. And we're going to, at the end, say what the Broad Institute and Google are looking to do, because we think this is the right idea at the right time, is find 3 organizations to work with and turn this real, and actually have the next 3 examples after the missing database and say, what would it take to do that? And what we don't know is whether it's going to be cookie cutter exactly, let's just do exactly what we did before and do it again, or whether it's going to be very different, or whether those 3 will be the same. We'll find that out through discussion. So that's what we intend to do here, is walk through sort of framing what we think it means to generalize the work that we've done once, and then talk with you all. So introductions, I introduced myself before, but as I said, I'm a software guy. And I've been doing software my whole life, and I started on genomics just about 2 years ago. I think Brad Margus was in my first meeting where I said, so wait, so what is a sequence? What do you call that thing? What does that do? And have built a bilingual team of people at Google who some speak software, some speak DNA, some speak both. And have been working with Anthony since those first days in various capacities to make this thing real.
I like to tease David that when I first met him, he didn't know how to spell DNA. So David and I work quite closely together and we'll get a little bit more into that kind of throughout the relationship, or throughout the talk here. I'm a doctor, and that's my primary job. I'm a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I'm a cardiologist, and I specialize in seeing patients with rare genetic cardiovascular diseases. So, for example, some of the heritable arrhythmias, where you hear about the tragic events with high school athletes. That's kind of the patient population that I take care of. And I entered med school in 2001, which was the year the human genome was sequenced. And I was originally a math nerd. And really, since I started med school, I've had only one ambition in my life, which is to be a part of bringing genetics into medicine. And everything I've done since I was basically 18 years old has been sort of around that goal. I'm currently at a place called the Broad Institute, which is the largest genome sequencing center in the world. And there I lead a team that does a lot of data analysis, and we work very closely with David Glazer and our folks at Google. So it's just a little bit about me.
All right. So this is the premise. This is what we think is true. We talked about it a little bit, but we think now is the time to take an ad. Now is the time to make Anthony's high school dream come true. Now is the time to really apply what's possible with genomics today and bring that into the picture to help make a difference in lots of different areas, but in particular in the rare disease community, or several of these communities. And we think the right way to do this is with a data donor-centric vision. So we're starting to work on it now. We want to get your feedback. Traditionally, the way this stuff is done is it's a little too bottlenecked. We heard this in the question just before. It's like, I've got this great thing going on, but there's these people who are kind of controlling the data, and I'm not quite sure what's possible with it, right? It's like, that is traditional, and it's gotten us a long way forward. I don't mean to dismiss it as a good step, but we think there's an opportunity now to use technology to build a platform that can help with connecting the people who are providing the data with the people who are learning from the data. And we think that that helps because it really, first it helps just sort of, what's the right word? Maybe from just a position of who's who, it helps by recognizing who's in the driving who should be in control here? These are not research participants, meaning lab rats. These are not research participants, meaning people who exist for the purposes of providing data into a spreadsheet. These are the people who are donating their data to help learn things, right? So let's recognize that. Let's have that be front and center. When you do that and you do it with the right way, you enable better learning, better research, you get recontact capabilities, you get easier research, more researchers can get at more data, you get, as we talked about, the ability to pool data across more places. And the more that we can put technology in the middle, the more it becomes scalable. I've given a talk a couple of times where I talk about how the world of genomics is transitioning, like approximately this year, from an artisan scale endeavor to a factory scale endeavor. And the Broad is one of the pioneers at doing the wet lab side of things, the actual sequencing processing at factory scale. Google knows how to work with information at factory scale. We have the opportunity to use technology to make things bigger and better. So with that, Anthony's going to talk through at a high level how we see these pieces coming together.
Yeah, and to reemphasize something that we said at the beginning, which is that we're at the beginning of this journey, and we were really especially excited to come and talk to you about this. And one person I really want to call out who's been a thought partner, who really probably should be up here, is Brad Margus, who really kind of planted this idea in our head. And so, to kind of motivate is, what we really want is your feedback from you as disease communities on what you would like to see. And I want to stress that we really are quite humble and open to feedback on this. I think one of the things that I've learned in my life as a clinician, seeing patients with rare diseases, is that it's very often the case that my patients know a lot more about their disease than I do. There's only so much one can know. And I think that we really hope that we can bring that same kind of humility to this approach, where we have an idea of what we think is right, but this is just a starting point. And I really want all of you to kind of start walking us through and say, no, this is really not what we want this instead, and we're all ears. So as we conceptualize this, there are roughly 3 pieces that you need to get started. And I want to stress that we're talking about getting started here. One of the phrases that David, as a real veteran of the software industry, has taught me is the importance of getting to what's called a minimum viable product, which is to say the smallest thing that you can imagine building that will actually provide value to people. And then you should get it out in front of people and get feedback on it, and then there's all sorts of ways you can extend it. So as we're talking through this, we're thinking of this as the minimum viable product. What's the minimum thing that we could build and get off the ground as fast as possible and put in front of you for you to say, it should be improved in this way. So as we talk about it, I think there are 3 components. The first is a patient or donor-facing portal. And the basic idea here is that people in your community can go to a web page and consent and say, I want to donate my data. And we'll get a little bit more on what that means. And you establish a link with the person at that point. Then the second thing is we'd like to start being able to collect data from people. And this is of 2 forms. So first is to actually get DNA data to sequence. And that would usually be in the form of a spit kit. And I'll get into what that means in a second. But basically, we have the ability, the Broad Institute has the ability today to send a spit kit in the mail to anyone and get it sequenced after they've been consented. Similarly, there's a harder problem, which is actually collecting phenotypic information. And this, again, is where we'd like to sort of get some perspective from you guys on what's hard, what's easy, where is your community in the process right now. So we'll collect that. And then there's a third component, which is to put it into a database where researchers from around the world can get access to it and study it and do experiments or do research on it, right? And again, there are all sorts of really tricky questions here. So for example, and we'll get into this in more detail, but should anyone be able to get access to it, or should only people who are registered scientists, whatever that means? One of the things, I've had this conversation with Brad several times where he said, I want the person from the teenager in India who has a brilliant new algorithm to get access to my patient's data. Other people might not have that same sort of openness and might have a little bit more concerns about privacy. These are the kind of things we want to understand. So let me walk through each of these 3 components one at a time. And again, I really do want sort of comments and questions. Okay, so first, let's talk about this donor-facing page. So the first question I have for everyone here is, when we think about consenting people and collecting your data to enable research in your community, how important is it to have a Chinese menu of options? So let's make it concrete for a second. You might say, it's only available for nonprofit research. And that sounds pretty good, except that a lot of times a motivation for doing an effort like this might be to help recruit a biotech or pharmaceutical to try and run a trial on your disease. And so right away, you've really lessened the probability of that happening by setting up the non-for-profit restriction, right? So let me put this question out to people there. What would you want in a consent form? Would it really just be, we're going to make a good faith effort to keep your data private, and there's no array of options, no Chinese menu of, you can have A or B but not C? Or would you really want the people in your community to be able to specify their own personal preferences? Please.
I think it's important that people can specify their own personal preferences with the caveat that they can go back and change that at a later date, because some people just, I have my DNA sequence, so it's part of a trio, but my dad won't do it because he doesn't want anyone having his DNA and sequence out there. So, and my mom did it, and I needed my DNA double sequence for something else, and so she went back and reconsented to find out if she was a carrier for Lynn syndrome, right? So that sort of thing can happen. I think that's an ideal situation.
I tend to agree. I mean, for me, I'm pretty open. I really want to be able to share. I mean, like, I think one thing that would speak to everyone is just having that real-time access of having it like plain English, like a simple UI where I can come in later and say if I change my mind on something, I can do that. It's not, logged forever. But I think also to throw a question back to you, this information is all going to be de-identified, either anonymous or provided. So if that's the case, then that provides a lot of comfort to me, and I really don't have much restriction at all on who I want to see it, as long as it's not personally identifiable.
It's true. Let me kind of just push, well, let me answer your question, and David will too, but let me push another question too, which is kind of the last one. You're right, we're certainly not imagining storing names or medical records or addresses or phone numbers or things like that. I think one of the things we all have to be realistic about is privacy is complicated, and even though I might strip away all that information, it's very possible that someone who may or may not have good intentions could look at the information that is available and figure out who you are. I think a famous example of this was a researcher a couple years ago, and this was with very good intentions to show that this is a real concern, showed that in males you can often infer someone's last name by looking at their DNA, because that's a Y chromosome, and that often tracks, with your last name. It's complicated. So let me put this question about how often would you be willing to be recontacted? Like, do you feel that people in your community, would you want to get pinged every time a researcher tried to access your data? And it might be a lot of emails. Go ahead.
I, as an executive director of a nonprofit that deals with a very rare neuromuscular disease, I can say that I'm totally on the right side in terms of like getting the information out there, making it accessible, moving faster towards that. But where the intersection of the science and patients, these two questions you just asked are really the same one. So I think if it makes it easier for the patient to share their data, if they're made to feel comfortable that it's not going to be sold to somebody. And I think even pharmaceutical companies should be working in tandem with a nonprofit just to make it in bite-sized pieces, baby steps that we can actually end up getting there, even if it takes a little while to get going. I think then they would accept more phone calls, more interaction from that, because it makes them feel more in charge. And as that progresses, I think then they'll let go and say, all right, fine, just don't call me again, I need to use my data. That's what we've been told to do.
Go ahead.
I know my biggest concern with that issue before isn't really the consent. My biggest concern is that down the road, an insurance company can use it.
Well, that's
Saying that, see, you already had the test. The syndrome we got less than 90% of the test. And it comes with heart issues, we don't get heart issues. And my big fear is if down the road I have heart issues, they'll say, well, see, you already in study, so we don't have to cover this. That's my big concern. And my other big concern is, because I think also that is that the media doesn't report it. I don't want, that's my big concern, I don't want my life to start preaching, so, you know what I mean? With everybody with Rett syndrome or workers less than 100%.
So let me ask a slightly different question for a second. And this is something that Brad said, and I don't know if it was obvious to me, but then once I heard it, I think it's really true. Is that imagine you're going to, in addition to consenting people, you're going to ask questions, about the natural history of the disease, and that's really valuable for, clinical trials downstream. So imagine that you're getting push questions about, the development or things of that nature. Would you want to get feedback on how other people in your community answered? And this would be like in an aggregated form.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's an unequivocal yes. And everybody agrees that you'd want to be pushed questions.
And therefore you'd be willing to give permission for your answers to be shared in an aggregated way? Okay, just the obvious.
That would be my point of view. Explain why you want that permission, what's to be done with it. I think that helps the patients to get past that barriers and weigh the risk more accurately. Do I want to give this information knowing that I might be using it to get this benefit? Because I think it all comes down, we make these kinds of decisions as parents all day long about drugs, about everything that we do for our kids. What's the risk versus the benefit? And if you know more about the benefit, see, a lot of times we know what the risks are. We don't necessarily understand the benefit of providing that information. So if it's pretty clear about why that's being collected, I think that would go a long way towards.
So
A lot of times we're in the middle of having to deal with kids' issues and being in and out of hospital and trying to keep their lives as normal as possible. It's not easy now. We don't want it out there, and we want our kids to have shelter. But we can deal with the reality of it, and like I said, the last thing I need is for it to get in the paper and make their life even harder than it is now. So I think it'd be better if there was a guarantee in there that the insurance companies would be able to pay.
Well, I mean, there's GINA, which does what it does, but it is designed to address that fear. I'm not the lawyer on that, but I know that is.
You can understand where I'm coming from.
Of course.
We're worried now,
Yeah.
I think having, the aggregate answer is absolutely critical, especially for those of us who run foundations, because then we build into that, your questionnaire, really be able to answer something we may want to know about too.
Yeah.
And how should we approach building the questionnaire? So, should we work directly with the disease foundation? Should we be working with specialists that you are most close to?
So I think social scientists who know how to build questionnaires is paramount, and also with foundations who come up with questions. Because we can vet the questions and say that's really a harmful question.
Yeah.
I reviewed the data collection. For me, that's paramount because the rare disorder that I represent has many subsets of symptoms, and very few doctors and andrologists know about it. So with the registry, we're able to identify patterns for them to actually pay attention.
Sure.
And in the last couple of years, we've actually had doctors pay attention to some of those, and researchers to some of those subsets of symptoms, so that now we're going towards research.
So okay, new hands. I'd rather hear new voices first. So let's take in the back, and then you can be next.
Thank you. What you're talking about is just like you match.
Just-
So when I go out and register bone marrow donors, I tell them that they're going to fill out the questionnaire. They're going to get their mouth swabbed with the Q-tips. They're not just going to donate to a person that has a need that they know. They're going to donate to whomever they're matching. So that's exactly like be the match. When you talk about the questionnaire, you have to include patients and parents because the medical staff looks at things different. So, and you might have to have open-end questions because some illnesses are different than others. But my question to you, I have two questions. Number one, just like be the match, when they sign the questionnaire, they're given a number. Okay, so I have to put numbers, and they have a card with their number. So that number refers them, so they
Right.
don't have to use their name.
Yep.
That's the confidential.
Yep.
Okay, so the
Yes.
second thing is, if somebody's gonna make money off of us, can they at least donate something back to the cause? Because that too often happens.
Yeah.
That they keep the money and they don't donate. So we're helping them, but we also need them to help us.
And yeah.
flow is in one direction, right? Which patient is providing information to whoever is doing the study. It strikes me that the solution to patient concerns may be partially allayed by turning this into a two-way information system. What I mean by that is once you've donated whatever it is you're donating, that should allow you in the future to be updated. You should be able to find out. There's now 2 drugs that are available to treat your condition.
Yeah.
There are now 3 clinical trials in the United States, 1 in Europe and 1 in Asia, that are dealing exactly with what you have. And that's what's missing from what I see is that type of two-way flow of information, which makes this whole process much simpler.
Yeah, actually, to speak to that, I think 100% agree. Kind of going back to the minimum viable notion, I think we all imagine that there are 2 additions that are really natural. And so one is that patient-facing portal, not just for donating their data, but for getting back results. Our kind of thinking was, again, just to get it off the ground in the interest of getting there as quickly as possible. That might not be the first thing you would do, but again, we don't know everything, right? And we know very little. So that's one question. Similarly, there's another side too, which, again, going back to my point about as a rare disease doc, I often see a patient that I've never seen before. And I really wish I had better resources where when I'm preparing to see a patient in clinic, I can better know what questions to ask for and those same point about what clinical trials are out there. It's as a doc, it's not so easy to find that information either, and that could be very valuable to my patients. So I think that it's very natural that that's 2 areas where it clearly needs to go quickly.
So I want to make one more point on this, and let's move on.
Yeah.
So we've got, because there's 2 other meaty areas to talk about. Just on the consent thing, I just want to plant a tangible answer as an anchor and say, hey, here's what Autism Speaks did, right? Which is not, well, there wasn't one voice here, but it wasn't any one of these, but here's what they did. The people who donate to Autism Speaks signed a consent form. The consent form roughly says, they're redoing it to have the language be clearer, but it roughly says, I'm giving you this information for the good of research. I'm making it available to whomever you deem is a qualified researcher to use for whatever purposes you, Autism Speaks, deem are good research purposes. And I understand that you are going to try very hard to keep it private, and that everyone who uses it has to promise to try very hard to keep it private, but there are no 100% guarantees. And that's the model they went with. They did not go with the Chinese menu. They went with a trusted intermediary in their case, it was the Disease Foundation, and said, we're going to delegate to you. That's the model they went with.
And this was an online only consent form, no phone calls, no written version?
No, I think these were actually done. I'd have to check, but they were done a while ago, and I'm pretty sure they were done the traditional way, with someone sitting down with a person, going through some paper, and signing a form.
Do you think we have to do that now? Or can
I
we
don't
do
think
it
so.
online?
I think the work.
And will IRB boards allow that?
I think so. I think that's a lot of the work that Sage did on ResearchKit was coming up with clear enough interactions that IRBs say, yeah, you know what you're saying. So there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but to Anthony's earlier point, there's a lot. The simpler it is, the better it is for everybody, and the more knobs and levers you add, each one of them helps, and then all of them hurt. So, all right. So unless there's anything burning, I want to move on, and then we can come back as.
That's what I was just going to say, is we can definitely come back to these questions. So let's talk about the actual data itself. So to walk you through. As we said, we kind of envision that in the beginning, there are 2 basic data types that we would collect, which is sort of information about your clinical or phenotypic history, and then also DNA for sequencing. And to be kind of clear, we're talking about DNA that's, so to speak, your germline, which is the DNA all over your body. Many syndromes, for example, have cancer associated with sort of the constellation of the disease. That again would be great to do going forward eventually. More complicated because you got to be able to get in touch with the hospital and get a block biopsy and stuff. So for the moment, we're just talking about this. So 2 questions right off the bat. So if you think about, let me start off with the second one. So the place where I work, at the Broad Institute, we have the ability to collect we either can work with serum or we can work with saliva.
Serum means blood for
Blood,
the non-doctors.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, for those of you who might have emesis or start using all sorts of medical terms. No, but so blood or saliva. Now, of course, there's a problem with saliva is that the failure rate is higher, about 10%, and that means sometimes you have to recollect it, and you know, when it fails, you've got to pay for resequencing. Obviously, for individuals, much more convenient to get a spit kit sent to you than to have to find a place to draw blood. Any thoughts on, you know, strong preferences one way or another on that decision?
Draw blood all the time. Yeah. I don't have any problem with that. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Is there a way for some of the, medical clinics that are available to us to start opening up availability to go in and have your DNA done through one test? Because the last time I went to the ALA last year and we talked about genetics, I live in Orange County and UCI, St. Jude, St. Joseph, none of them are familiar,
Yeah. Well, I can say that Anthony can't quite say. If you're trying to do population-wide sequencing, you don't really want to have lots of different clinics do it, even if they can. Send it to Anthony and his lab. No, seriously, that's what the Broad Institute does, right? So and what we would, so there's lots of answers to it, but what we're picturing here is that if this made sense for your community, part of how it would make sense is we could answer that question. It's not, there's no requirement. There are plenty of other people who can sequence, but it's the easiest way, and it's just one.
I'm just saying I'd like to see it become readily available.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe even tissue collection, is that going to be considered? We're already starting to push people in that direction.
Sure. So I mean, it's a great question. My sense is that to try and get, you know, tissue from a biopsy, probably too hard in the beginning relative to a spit kit. But I could be wrong.
Or even relative just to blood.
Yeah, or even just relative to blood.
So would it be that you all would send the blood kit and we take it to our local, when we go to the doctor or whatever, they draw, put it in, and we mail it to you?
I don't know. Is that how?
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
our picture.
so
Are you set up for that?
yeah, so I mean, again, it's a good question. Yeah.
My name's Gina Zanuck, and we did the exome sequencing with no answers, and we did the Touch Genome project with my family, the 5 of us, and my parents. My parents were in Wisconsin. There's a company that we call, my dad at 75 researched it. They showed up at the door, they took his blood, they packaged it, they took it to FedEx, it arrived at the Utah Genome Center the next day. Very easy. And I would not want to risk a 10% failure.
Okay. No, and there are many companies that are kind of doing Uber for phlebotomy. So the expectation is that you would work with them. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it bears mentioning because a lot of us have our foundations it's our children that are affected, and I'm all for the blood sample is super duper easy, it's great, it's wonderful, but I'm also a mom that says to my kids, you need to do this because we need to get to the finish line. But on our foundation's board of families, the board of directors, in just the 8 families, there is one family where the kids have said, absolutely not, I can't have my blood drawn. So I think it does, I know that this is the choir we're preaching to here, we all would do anything, but there are a lot of families out there that scares the bejesus out of them. If there's some way to do both, or yeah, they're going to risk the failure, I get that, but if we want them to participate because we need a number, I just think it's something you have to consider also.
Yeah, I think a both and is better than either or.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Can I add the other complicating factor with my situation? We talked about kids, is at least with, we have along with the syndrome, I have spectrum kids. Those kids have huge sensory issues around it. It's not as easy as a blood draw. It's a total meltdown sometimes. Right. We have to do it. So we may not have a choice, but to do the spit kit, because there's no way. My other 2 wee sons, they still don't like it, they understand. You can go into something else.
So now let me ask a slightly different question, which is when we think about the data that lives in a medical record or stuff that's not patient reported, but that's clinician reported. Does your community have that information already available within the community? Or is this the kind of thing that we'd need to work with you to figure out a solution to how to get it out of the electronic medical record? So you need a solution. Anybody feel otherwise?
I mean, if we couldn't get your assistance, we do have some data, but I think it's an ongoing thing, and having your assistance is key.
Yeah,
We have, for example, a clinic where people have come or send information from their local doctors to us, but it's incomplete.
yeah, just to set expectations, that's a hard, messy problem, and it's going to stay one no matter how much we do or don't help. We've collectively and individually talked to a bunch of people who have said, "Oh, there's got to be a way to get that." There's not an easy answer. So, all right, let's keep
on
going
going.
because I want to
Yeah.
get
I think. Oh yeah, and then so again, one other question is, again, in the spirit of getting something up and off the ground quickly, if you're going to return results to the patients or to a physician, then it has to be done in a CLIA environment, and that imposes a lot more cost, a lot more regulatory oversight, and our feeling was that in the beginning, it's probably not worth it. But this is a question we wanted to hear from you guys.
Yeah, and this, in my opinion, is an unfortunate reality of the way the rules are written today, but it's a very real reality of the way the rules are written.
I think it depends on your syndrome. For mine, it's okay, but for some people, it's not.
Okay.
I would say that for a life or death type condition, that information can save a life. Having it that way. I mean, ours is not necessarily that. We're lucky in that the clinician is also the researcher, so we can.
Sure. All right, so.
A lot of the cases.
So maybe we'll press on. Maybe I'll turn over David to the last one, which is a lot about sort of the data side of things.
Yeah, so I think I've got the. So I think we covered that first one a bit, and I don't want to. We're not done with it, but I don't want to spend more of our time right now on it. The second one I'm interested in. How important is it? Following up on what Anthony was asking about physicians, that you can get back your sequence, your kid's sequence, and look at that. Is that
Because there's often secondary things that are going on in
Okay.
our kids.
Yeah, so that's certainly what I would want. I just know that that's not the way the default rules are written, and that takes.
I think people are getting more. I'm Silicon Valley refugee, and I've seen the cycle of transition where people are beginning to realize that their data has value,
Yeah.
and that it's got to be a quid pro quo. I'm telling you, I'm getting that more and more and more.
Yeah, I mean, because as just saying something you all know, that is not the default. That the norm is, if you participate in research, you have donated your data and you don't get it back. That's the norm.
The age of transparency is a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
We
So.
have to collaborate with the researchers, and they have to collaborate with the
Yeah.
patients.
Okay. All right. So I think we all. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're all in agreement.
I vehemently agree. I think the interesting bit will be how do we work together to make that possible.
Yeah.
Just one. With Howard Jacobs gave me our hard drive.
Sure.
So I walked up to the genetics conference in Salt Lake City and to everybody said, anybody help me with my data, my DNA on my hard drive as a stay-at-home mom? And so it's possible. You just have to tell the people that want you to do the research and said, as long as you take our blood, I want that data. That's mine. So it's possible.
Yeah. And one there.
One of the things I'd like to see too is, along with just the DNA, is for you guys to do a personal history and family. We have other issues going on that we suspect are linked to the syndrome, but there's so few of us. I have two of my three kids with the same syndrome. They're the ones that are sensitive. All three of them on the spectrum. We all suspect that has something to do with the syndrome. My youngest guy has Tourette's. Nobody in the family has Tourette's. We suspect. I'd like to see that they take personal history too, and it's shared not just with the DNA researchers, but when you see somebody like my youngest with his 12 kilos and Tourette's, that we make sure it gets to the Tourette's people. You know what I mean? Hey, this may be another key for you to figure out Tourette's. Or this may be another key to figure out autism. You know what I mean?
So this is important too for, as I said in the previous session about doing the natural history. Because we have a lot of these diseases that have a spectrum, have a complex symptomology. So showing efficacy to like the FDA of any potential treatment is going to be a big challenge unless we crunch this data and show that there's all these different endpoints that could have been improved.
And
So
along those lines.
No one is definitively improved for everybody, but if everyone showed improvement, that's a whole different story that we can say, hey, this is something effective for our kids.
So let me ask you a question along those lines, and it's related to both of these points. How do you feel about allowing researchers to recontact you? So you love it. Okay.
I mean, I think that actually
Yeah.
is completely
Okay.
consistent with the other vehement yes of I
That's
want to be
great.
part of this. We want to be involved. So just one meta observation as I'm listening to this, and this is great. I have different opinions than I did 45 minutes ago. That was the goal, right? The meta observation is that I think part of finding a win here is going to involve both picking min viable wisely, right? Deciding where to walk before we run. And it's going to involve playing to our respective strengths, right? So there's some things that I'm hearing people ask for where it's like, yeah, Anthony can do that for you. And somewhere I'm saying, yeah, I can do that for you. And there's others where my first reaction is, nah, you don't really want either of us doing that. You want to do that for yourself. And I don't know exactly where those lines are, but I think for us to come here and say, just tell us everything you need and we're going to do it and here it is not going to work, right? We're the wrong people to do many of the things you're asking for and the right people to do many of the things you're asking for.
What they're asking for is to make sure that our resources are talking and cooperating, putting pieces together.
Yeah, well, again, so what I can do to help with that is I can make it incredibly technically easy so they have no excuses for not cooperating with each other, but I can't have them decide to cooperate if they don't want to. Well, and that's where both Matt and Brad made some points about fire your researchers when they say that.
I wanted to mention too is we were talking about people want to know as a result of the data, hey, we've got a new treatment. In our situation, there's not a new treatment. It is what it is.
That's right.
And what I would like to see though, if they're going to do that, is also I'm going to share my data. I would love you to come back and say, hey, because of your data, we're one step closer to stopping the hiring shift. You make me feel like, okay, it's on one step closer to figuring out what's causing the difference.
So one thing, just because we only have 5 minutes left, I just want to do the last 2 slides, and then whatever time left, we'll reopen to questions. So one is, I do want to say is that the second and third steps in terms of the ability to collect DNA, sequence it, put it in a database where that's access controlled and researchers have access to, we can do that today.
Which probably means we're 80 to 90% of the way there to matching the needs, but that's what it feels like to us is those parts are relatively understood, relatively take the things we're already good at, and we think we're pretty close to being able to work with,
But this first part, again, going back to the question of coming at this humbly, this is where we feel the most help, and I think everything we've heard today is that we want to learn from you. And to kind of cut to the chase is that, and maybe we'll make sure we put our emails up on the board, we want to do this. We want to move this forward. I think we can't do this yet at scale because we don't know the right answers. So we're looking for roughly 3 groups to partner with.
You said you think we're going to be oversubscribed, but that's a good thing.
I wanted to share with you because I know a lot of you are part of our foundational alliance, a lot of your advocates that we work with. When you guys are really ready to jump into that, you give us the type of groups you're looking for, and we can match you guys.
And I think I'm inventing some homework for us, Anthony, see what you think. But I think our job is to take what we've heard and write down a slightly more directed version of this and say, hey, here's a set of answers to these questions that we think we could do reasonably quickly. It's not going to be what all of the groups want. Which groups does that initial set of answers work for? Brad, were you?
So this, we're running out of time. We've spoken of kind of like subjects and what we care about and are we okay with our families and safety and getting part of the billions that people might make off of us and all that stuff. But could you take a second to talk about us as though we're all advocates trying to make progress in the research and make the data available. So one thing that's never talked about is the IRBs. And Anthony's expert on that because that's the world, but David, you actually just this point, do I need an IRB to approve this? I should probably ask people to sign some kind of a consent agreement in the beginning that says, when you tell us about your eating habits and your health and everything else, are you giving us your permission and can we use it for certain things? At one time, do I have to do that every time I have a new thing I want to analyze about data, or can we do one consent at the beginning? Because if you notice in the panel you were on, the lady from Sage, her thing kept saying, for this study.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it for a study. I'd like to get this one data set from all of you, have it be a living data set so I can keep going back. It's just not one more thing, because they'd like ease. So I go ask all of you that without having to go consent every time. Is that possible? Or do I need to get another consent, another IRB approved?
So I'll give the amateur answer and then
Look at the data, analyze it for me. Are they going to have to have some board of smart people at their institution approve it, so they have to actually be in a place that has a smart board? Are we going to have a board that decides if they're qualified enough to look at our scary data? Or can we just, because we're all consenting adults, and we all decided to do this study, just give the data to whoever we want in whatever format we want?
That's a great question.
Without,
yeah.
how does it really work? That sounds pretty good to me, but I think in reality, when I start talking about actually doing this, I get all these things where people use the word IRB. And maybe we need to have that in a bunch of IRB people in the next conference, but I need to differentiate between what's like legally required, what major hospitals and famous medical research sites insist on having to protect their own liability, versus what is kind of the practice that we can get out of and have a new way of doing things.
I like that question too, because I started a group on social media with 30 other families that have similar conditions to my kids. And we're all inputting all of our data. And I want my oncologist to have access to it, and he said he can't because they're not people like us. So he doesn't want to write on their data, that way. So this is really
Yeah. I don't know the full answer. Obviously, Brad knows that, but I know that the world is changing pretty quickly towards better answers as people are getting used to it. And there are starting to be IRBs that get it, and that people like you and like Autism Speaks and like some other folks have been designing a combination of a consent and a savvy IRB to move it. And I think part of the opportunity here is to craft a consent and an IRB that already know it, so that you all don't have to figure that out 200 times. That we can say, oh, look, this consent and this IRB have already been approved. Jump on if you'd like. So I'm optimistic we're months to, which probably means a year, away from that being a widespread thing. But I'm only optimistic.
And let me speak to it just a little bit. I have had a lot of calls with different IRBs. Almost, you do have to go through an IRB. This is human subjects research. I think it's hard to get around that. Whether or not you have to re-go through it every time you want to add on a new thing for a study depends on how you define your study. And this is where you need to work with people who have done it before, as Brad does, because he's been my biggest coach through this whole process. Do researchers need to go through an IRB? No. Right? For this purpose, everything I've heard, and I've asked this question.
It says you have to, because for example, Google can analyze
Yeah.
all ways I search data.
Well,
That's
but
human data, and I don't think you need an IRB.
well, so I mean, as you know, Facebook got in a lot of trouble for not consenting people for human subjects research, right? There was a paper published. It was research. They didn't consent. Everybody said that's not right, and nothing against Facebook. I'm kind of inclined to agree that you should ask people's permission before you.
The IRB is to not prevent progress, it's to keep checks and balances.
Yeah.
So a sensible human being will say, if you're a nonprofit and you have your intentions are right, your research, obviously you should have different checks and balances than someone who's doing this for money, right? And I think that's a natural divide right there. And I think we should
out of time.
for that.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, I have a feeling this is a topic we could probably, I know, how many of you would rather talk for another hour on this? Exactly. I'm sitting here thinking, I have so many more questions. I hope you guys come back next year and update us.
It would be an honor.
Hopefully we'll have some success stories and
Yeah,
in-progress
and we
stories.
definitely want to be a part of it. I know that everybody here, we can reach out to everybody here, so when you guys are ready for more voices to hear, we are ready to be, you guys are ready to be a voice, right?
Yeah.
So you guys, thank you very much, David. Thank you, Anna.
we'll